Hello to everybody joining. Welcome. We have a very special MSc today. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 588th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, the program's assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on the Saas-Fee Summer Institute of Art featuring Sarrita Hunn, Warren Neidich, Barry Schwabsky, and Thyrza Nichols Goodeve. And we're thrilled to welcome our very own Raevan Senior here to close today's program with a poetry reading. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for living documents of resources and actions. And the Brooklyn Rail would like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. And now to introduce today's host, writer, editor, artist, and interviewer, Thyrza Goodeve writes with rather than on contemporary art and artists. She is the author of How Like a Leaf, A Conversation with Donna Hathaway, published in 1999. She was the senior art editor at the Rail from 2017 to 2019 and is currently an editor at large. And I will pass it over to you, Thyrza, to introduce our guests. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Eleanor. Hello, community of Zoom land at the Brooklyn Rail. It's a pleasure to be doing hosting another one of these. It's a little bit different than what I'm used to because I'm in person here and there's actually an audience here, but we're also talking to you out in Zoom. And we're here, it's a really great occasion because it is about being together in one space. And we're going to be talking about the Saas-Fee Summer Institute, which was founded by Warren Neidich. We're going to be talking with Warren Neidich and Barry Schwabsky and Sarrita Hunn. And I'm not going to introduce their biographies that you can find out more about them, but she is the assistant co-founder, co-director. It's important to know that the theme of this week is this summer is on deep ecology and the cognitive capitalism scene, and it's what Warren has referred to as that this is a para-academic sort of institute that we will go into the history of it. It started, as Warren and Barry will introduce to you, in 2015. There's a few things that I've listed online in the chat that might help you. There's a wonderful article by Jennifer Tietz that was published in 2017 in Art and Education that gives a nice background to the Institute as well. One of the founding texts that might be important for people who aren't familiar with this term, cognitive capitalism, is also Yana Moulier-Boutong's book, published in 2012 on cognitive capitalism. So we have a link to that, a link to the article, and also a link to one of the people that will be speaking in this program to the students later on is Mackenzie Wark. And she actually in 2015 wrote a very interesting public seminar piece on cognitive capitalism. So since that's a sort of overview background, but without further ado, I want to introduce Warren, whose work on neuroaesthetics and brain plasticity as an artist, a philosopher, an editor, so on and so forth. It's my great pleasure. I've known Warren for a very long time. He will now tell you the history of this fantastic institute and para-academic institution.
Thank you, Thyrza, and thank you, Barry and Sarrita, because without these two, this program would be impossible. So I just want to thank them. To give you a little background on the Saas-Fee Summer Institute of Art, I have to go back to the year 2015, when Hubertus von Amalexen, a well-known philosopher, curator, and bon vivant, was speaking to me in Berlin about the possibility of creating an artistic program at the GSE and European Graduate School, and I accepted. Oh yeah, it takes place in Saas-Fee, and I accepted the offer. And then it was about assembling a team, and I knew Barry for a very long time, and asked him to, help me in creating this environment. So we were at the European Graduate School for one summer, and it was a sensational program, and we loved working with them, and we loved being in the same environment with them. It was incredible, but unfortunately, they didn't have very much of a public. And one of the aspects of our program is a public program. We have this, communal gathering, this private school, but we also have this free public educational system. And Saas-Fee just didn't afford that opportunity. So we basically decided, I was living in Berlin part-time at that time, and many of the like Guido Steyer and other people who participated in the early days, Amsel Franke, all these people, they all were kind of Berlin based. So we decided to go to Berlin and to try our program there. And that's where it's been until, very recently. And here we are at the Brooklyn Rail at the invitation of Fang Bui. And I would also like to, of course, to thank him for his amazing generosity, but also for being himself, because so much of the value system that we hold dear to ourselves at the Saas-Fee Summer Institute are also values that Fang and the Brooklyn Rail embody. So it's actually a wonderful combination, a wonderful collaboration. And so that's all I want to say for now.
Do you want to give a bit of a background on the philosophy of it? Because
Okay.
it comes out of your work, and then Barry can go into the history.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. One of the most, we call ourselves, we're going to go into this a little bit more in depth about why we call ourselves a para-academic institution. And Sarrita is going to really address that. But part of the reason why we do that, though, is one of the reasons is we're mobile, we're nomadic, but we also felt that we wanted to talk about things that we felt were not being part of the curriculum of most art schools. In fact, there had been in our minds, and it may be true or not true, we had seen a kind of denigration in the academia surrounding art schools, especially in philosophy and theory. And so we wanted to rectify that situation. But at Saas-Fee Summer Institute of Art, we have a very, very special idea about what theory is and what theory can do. The importance of it is, although I'm not saying it can be, it's both, it's a continuum, so it's not one way or the other, but just to say that here, we believe that artists, philosophers, writers, poets, filmmakers, media artists, et cetera, they disrupt the socio-political, cultural, technological milieu, habitus in such a way that it requires philosophy to retool itself. And that's the key. Art comes before philosophy. We also understand that many artists are embedded and involved in philosophy, and that becomes a very important foundation for their work. And we're not saying that's the wrong way or the right way. We're just saying that our way is that we believe that art is an instigator in new philosophical conceptual manifestations. So that's like one of the keys, I think, for this kind of idea of Saas-Fee Summer Institute of Art and this idea of a para-academic condition. The other very important thing that Thyrza alluded to was our interests and our involvement in this idea of cognitive capitalism. This involvement for myself started in 2010 when I wrote this book called Cognitive Architecture from Biopolitics to New Politics. And I invited Jan Moulier-Boutang, who wrote that book on cognitive capitalism, Maurizio Lazzarato, Paolo Verno, and Franco Berardi. And as part of a conceptual module that which was part of this thing called Rethinking the City, of which this, cognitive architecture book emerged out of. And that was a kind of module that informed this discourse. And from that point on, I became more and more involved. And I wanted to create a school, this para-academic thing, the Saas-Fee Summer Institute, around the idea of cognitive capitalism, the idea that the mind and the brain are the new factories of the 21st century. We are no longer proletariats, we are cognitariats, mental laborers who are in front of screens and working on iPhones and such to create data, and that the data isn't passive. It's not just being collected and datified and made into statistics, but it's actually a active component in the sculpting through various manifestations, which we're all going to talk about, like epiphylogenesis and things like that we'll get into later, in sculpting the neuroplasticity of the brain to create a new forms of architecture. And we, manifested maybe between the digital native and the digital immigrant, if we were going to go that far. But this idea that this digitalization, and I think this has a lot to do with deep ecology, because everything in nature is becoming digitalized. Animals are wearing collars that are being, that scientists are monitoring. And, there's this whole datification of the whole ecological system that I think is an important consideration that we'll also bring in later. But so cognitive capitalism became an essential component. And I might add also that we are critiquing the new economy, and that this new economy is going through a rupture, a crisis, similar to what instigated the cognitive capitalists in the 1980s to create their discourse, which was the digitalization and the cyberization of labor. I think another crisis is at our doorstep, which I call the neural economy or neural capitalism, in which the brain and its neuroplasticity are becoming the focus of capitalization, commoditization, with very, very scary effects for instance, surveillance. So what happens, my last statement is, what happens when instead of a click on a mouse with your fingertip, that you are using your brain waves to search the web or to interact with VR or whatever. And all of a sudden, that's what's being datafied. That's what's being collated. And what about the consciousness and unconsciousness? And finally, if you can decode, if we can use our brainwaves to manipulate a cursor on a screen to move a wheelchair, as people who are paraplegic or tetraplegic can, or if we can do these things, and if there is a codification system that can take those brainwaves and create them into a code that can do these things, then it's not hard to imagine that a code could be considered and created that could go the opposite direction from and that's what Reza Negostrani is going to talk about, is how far is that from actually coming into the brain and giving it orders and a new kind of despotism, and maybe even sculpting the neuroplasticity.
Fantastic. Thank you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Institute, we also have a link online for the program for this summer and who will be speaking, and some of the people that Warren was talking about, and some of those are public lectures. Otherwise, there's a non-public group here. So I would like to hear now from Barry, who I know you came to this through being there at that famous summer at Saas-Fee and working with Warren, but you were also interested, you felt there was a crisis at that moment in terms of the art world in terms of, and you put it, I think, in one piece about that the school is being run by administrators and less by faculty, right? So I wanted your personal interest and then literally kind of a history for people of the various summers since then. So thank you.
Okay, yeah, I think that it was actually an amazing moment when Warren called me up that time, and I don't remember what month in 2015, and said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a school. Do you want to work with me on this? Because at that moment, I had been discussing with other people the idea that we're completely dissatisfied with what we've seen and experienced of arts education in the art schools and universities. And it's precisely this issue that we've come so far away from, you can even say the origins of the university, which was something that belonged to the teachers and the students. And now it's something to which, the teachers and students are kind of expendable features, and it really belongs to the administration. And it just seemed to be something that so many of us felt was stifling about working in those kind of schools, which then, of course, also they do many wonderful things, but there are many things that they can't do because of the structure that they have. And
can I interrupt for a moment just
Yeah.
to add to that? I also think that this also comes out of the problem of the or the interest in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, and that I've been part of the interdisciplinary community forever, from undergraduate forever. That's what I am. That's why I work as a writer with artists, because they're really the most transdisciplinary that there are. And that in MFA programs, we may talk about it, transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary, but it inevitably starts to become focused either through art or through art history or through one discipline or another. And having come out of a PhD program that was interdisciplinary, I know how hard it is to really teach and talk across disciplines. And I think you can only do that outside of the institution. I teach in many MFA programs, but each MFA program has its own disciplinary boundaries. So I think what's really exciting and unique to this is it's international, and that it literally is transdisciplinary, right? And that's what the art making is coming out of.
Absolutely. Anyway, when I got that call, I realized that with my other interlocutors, I could have been grousing about the state of academia and complaining and talking about we should do this and we should do that, and never do it. Just keep talking about it. I knew Warren was going to do it, so I joined with him. And as he mentioned, he kind of brought us into working with Hubertus in Saas-Fee, where we collaborated with the European Graduate School, but we weren't part of them. We were our own separate entity there. And then from there moved on mostly to Berlin, although we've also done sessions here in New York before. Warren, you did the online session at Saas-Fee with and the one in Los Angeles, but basically until COVID, Berlin was our base. And essentially the development of the thinking in the school, I think, can be found a little bit in the titles of the the themes for each year's course. Our initial one was Art and the Politics of Estrangement. And so I think you hear that there are like three kind of key words there, but the first one is art. And that means that we were always about art making, aesthetics, but in relation to the wider world of things that art touches upon. And that wider world of things is always a political world for us. And maybe Warren has another viewpoint on this, but I would say for me, it's really important that we started with Estrangement, because in my mind, I really go along with Hannah Arendt and the idea that thinking always starts with taking a distance. And so you have to be estranged from your habitus in order to understand what that habitus is. And art is one of the essential ways that that happens for people. So from there, I think the first 3 years kind of make a cycle in themselves, and the titles all have a kind of similar structure. Again, it's the first one, Art and the Politics of Estrangement. Then the second year, the first year in Berlin, was Art and the Politics of Individuation. And the third year was Art and the Politics of Collectivity. And so I think you can just hear from that the kind of dialectic we were somehow trying to work our way through. Then in the fourth year, I think there's an interesting transition that comes out, and I've written it down because it's a more complicated one, so I have to make sure I say it right. Art and the Poetics, not the Poetics of Praxis in Cognitive Capitalism. Now, cognitive capitalism as a concept had been part of the background of what we were doing from the beginning, but that was the first year in which that really came into focus as part of the essence of what we are trying to do there. And cognitive capitalism has stayed in the title of most of our sessions since then. For me, what was interesting about it is that I had come to realize that that concept of cognitive capitalism, as Jean-Millie Boutin lays out, he's been part of our courses various times over the years, really, for me, gives a much clearer sense of the contemporary modes of exploitation and extraction that we're all living through than in a way, much more common idea of neoliberalism that you see referred to much more. I think cognitive capitalism gives a much more specific kind of characterization of how our ways of working and of being worked upon have been changed. And of course, that doesn't mean that, industry is gone. It's not like, just as when the basis of the economy switched from agriculture to industry, doesn't mean that agriculture went away. We still have agriculture and we still have heavy industry in the world, but the mode that sort of rules all the rest and gives them their place in the system is the one of cognitive capitalism. Is that?
Yeah. And just to add a little bit to what Barry was saying, I think that what's been really interesting through this, through the evolution of the school and the evolution of the thinking that has developed here. And as I said, it's not only the people that we're bringing in here to speak with you, but it's the participants, yourselves, and what you're giving to us. There has been an evolution, I think, of the thoughts, and that I think that what I'm right now into and what I'm thinking more about is what I'm calling the consciousness industry. So I'm thinking now, we know about the Society of the Spectacle, that the Situationists, Guy Debord and what all that meant and the kind of alienation that occurred and especially, you know, and the kinds of apparatuses of emancipation like dérive, you know, and different kinds of strategies that they instituted. And then in cognitive capitalism, you know, there are other kinds of apparatuses, but cognitive capitalism, not only is it in this stage, and you know, when you say cognitive capitalism, I'm sure you know, every one of you know what cognitive capitalism is and have heard people and artists working on it. Like for instance, when you hear precarious, how many art shows and art exhibitions and artists that you know are working with the idea of precarity? Well, precarity is one of the fundamental concepts of cognitive capitalism. Valorization economies. We've moved from value to valorization. What is valorization? It means that rumor, public relations, communication has now created the value, or what's valorized, what we all agree on is important. That's another. How many times have you heard that? How about immaterial labor? Immaterial labor, right? That is taken over from immaterial labor is performance. The incredible interest in performance in the last 10 or 15 years is a manifestation of a kind of knowledge, an unconscious latent knowledge that is pervading in our society and our culture about labor that has been transmitted into a reenactment of performative strategies, right? How, you know, performance of the 60s and the 70s, all of a sudden is an important strategy, an important element of artists' armamentarium today. That's coming out of cognitive capitalism. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I just guide you for a moment?
Sure.
Because I think,
Be our guide.
well, that's my role. Because I think tying it as much to this deep ecology idea is what I would like to get us into, but I'm feeling a little bit as a host rude because I think Sarrita should be coming in at this point, and describing how she came into it, because you came in 2018.
Yes, that's correct.
So please.
Yes.
Yeah, no, maybe I'll just add to what Barry and Warren has already said. Hopefully everybody can hear me. That I got involved with Saas-Fee in 2018. I think it was the second program in Berlin. It was the Poetics of Praxis program that Barry mentioned, actually. And I don't know if we've actually connected these dots before, but previous to that, I was running a low residency summer MA program that was actually also canceled. So it was like quite literally this kind of, you know, coming out for me personally, also like Barry said, of a very neoliberal academic situation and living in Berlin at the time. And so having known Warren previously, like I was very excited when he invited me to be involved, because I think as we've all already said, that there is a way in which that, you know, this kind of transdisciplinary approach to these subject matters is really something that's quite difficult to do within academia itself. So I would say in general that I think this is something that maybe we've also, you know, become increasingly aware of and cultivated to some extent, but I really have grown to understand, you know, through the different participants that have been interested in the program and the conversations that have come out of that, the way in which this program does play that very unique role of being, on the one hand, a site for people from different disciplines to have these discussions, but at the same time to be relatively artist-centered. And that's something also coming from my own practice, working in art criticism and curating and having a background as an artist myself. It's not about privileging the artist necessarily, but as Warren described, being somewhat unique in understanding the role that cultural practices can have in a social and political sense. And I think that's where all of us here share, you know, those values. Does that answer?
Yeah, and talk a bit more about why you stayed connected to the program and what you bring to the program specifically as an assistant.
yeah, for me to answer that question, you'll have to ask Warren and Barry. But yeah, no, I think for me, for example, I did a liberal arts undergraduate degree. So I was already initially very interested in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary practices. I have an undergraduate degree that is in studio art, art history, and philosophy, actually. And so I was already kind of working in this mode. And even when I decided to go to graduate school and study or to focus a little bit more on studio art, that I was looking at graduate programs that were very interdisciplinary. I ended up going to California College of the Arts, both because their MFA program had all of the disciplines together in the studios, but also it was an opportunity to take courses in the other graduate programs. So I took design courses, writing courses, as well as studio-based courses. And so I think I've always had this interdisciplinary background. And then I'm also have a history with organizing residency programs. I organized this MA program. And so I think the combination of this kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary interest, as well as like kind of administrating, really for me, like facilitating the situation under which that can happen. So when I was working as a residency program director with the Luminary, for example, in St. Louis, we also did a lot of experimental kind of structures, building kind of week-long workshops around canoeing, and all kinds of things. So I'm very interested in creating those situations in general. And I think for me, finding that Saas-Fee is actually a really unique and great fit in order to be able to do those things.
Why don't you talk about March and the magazine?
Yeah, so for example, like this is also manifested with, for me, in art criticism. So for about 10 years, I ran an art criticism website called Temporary Art Review that was originally started in St. Louis and focused on the US. And that was focused on artist-run spaces. So again, this history of like an artist-centered culture, and also looking at geographically outside of major art centers. So specifically not New York and LA, but looking at Milwaukee, Houston. And I co-founded Temporary Art Review with James McAnally. And that grew to become increasingly international over the years, and also more topically driven. And at some point we decided to actually transition that project. So we sort of closed Temporary in 2019. It was also temporary as we planned from the beginning. And in 2020, we launched March, a journal of art and strategy, which is online publishing as well as print publishing. So we basically tried to take all of the things that we had learned from our 10 years working with Temporary Art Review and kind of put that into March from the beginning. So for example, we have a really amazing advisory board that we invited from the beginning. And we also, again, started doing print, which we had never done before. James and I co-edited the first issue, which is actually an Occupation of October magazine or journal, as a kind of opportunity to talk about the fact that October actually started out as a very anti-academic journal. And then 50 years later, from its founding in 1976, we can see the way that's actually the most academic art criticism journal, arguably.
When you say occupation,
like it literally, I think I have a copy back there I can show you, but it literally looks like the first issue. And part of the impetus for that was that I was looking at the original letter from the editors, which is amazing, actually. I mean, they're, not only are they're laying out their relationship to the October Revolution and all of these things, but they're really talking about the role of anti-Vietnam War protest works and all of this, which could on some level be absolutely written today. So we basically, talking about situationists and determined, as we were discussing earlier, basically kind of rewrote or borrowed in some sense the original letter from the editors from 1976 and quite literally just switched out, some key parts that wasn't necessarily about the Vietnam War, but issues that we are facing today, and to really talk about what is this relationship between revolution and reform.
Oh, can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Is your use of the word strategy in the subtitle, is that a situationist reference or?
Actually, in the first issue, my co-founder James McAnally wrote a really great essay where we talk about the word strategy is actually coming mainly from Walter Benjamin, because Walter Benjamin and Bertolt Brecht met to start an art criticism magazine in Germany and Berlin in 1927, and it never happened. And during this time period is when Benjamin was really talking about the idea of the critic as strategist. And so it is about being a partisan critic. It's about recognizing the subjectivity and also the role of the critic to not only reflect on, but also create change. So the idea for us is that it's a strategic critical stance.
I think strategy has to become one of our key terms going forward.
Excellent. I'm all for that.
Yeah, because I just want to pick up on that example of the October magazine. It's excellent because, again, one of the topics that I've talked to Warren, you can print it up, to Warren about is this thing called theory that since the 80s I've often been associated with. Not so, and we use it as an object and a thing. To me, it's just about reading together various texts that change through time and that are about various kinds of ideas. But this idea of October magazine was started by Michelson, Rosalind Krauss. I don't know who the other Earl would have been. Not yet.
I think it was just those two.
Just those two. Okay. Obviously, a revolutionary academic art and historian women. I studied with Annette Michelson, cinema studies. So that's a wonderful moment. But then I think we've all become a bit, oh, is this not working? Have they not been able to hear us?
No, I think we're gonna have to speak really clearly into the computer microphone for a second.
Okay.
Can you hear us? Now you can hear us?
Yeah.
If we just sort of talk like this? Yeah. Okay.
We lean into it and talk really loud.
Yeah.
How long has this been going on?
Just for a second.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, while we fix the microphone, if you could just lean into the computer, it's a lot better to hear you that way.
So anyway, so the evolution of October, which continues to have such important writing in it and writing that people read and that artists read, and is also associated with artists, but also became, as you say, very academic.
Yeah.
And so much of reading major theory, everything from, Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari to more contemporary Rancière, into Donna Haraway and all sorts of work that people read. How do we as artists and I guess cultural workers engage with that without it becoming re-academized, right? I was associated for a long time with the Whitney Independent Study Program, which is also part of October and is part of that. But I too, can you hear me as I'm talking?
We can hear you.
But again, it's almost like a dialectic or a push-pull because we all go to schools, we graduate from MFAs, we teach in MFAs, we come back and forth. And so a place like this becomes a great landing platform for all of us, because it's not about rejecting or embracing completely. It's a kind of messy, ambiguous situating of ourselves within these texts that we're reading and that we're reading together and that we use as ways. What I want to segue into, because I think one of the great things about Saas-Fee is the way Warren introduced himself to the students this morning, I thought was important. He said, what we're here to do is to solve problems. So it's not just about what are people reading, what are people thinking, what are people making. And this is where we get back into, and I want to bring us back into thinking about deep ecology and who you've brought, who is going to be speaking, what kinds of issues are going to be brought in. maybe talk a bit about the range of the students that have been accepted this year, who obviously come from all sorts of different practices and places. That it also makes me think of Margaret Atwood. I don't know if you know this, but she's doing this class kind of online, and it's called Practical Utopias. Because everybody said, right? Dystopia. She used dystopia. She's, well, let's talk about utopia, but it can only be practical. We can't just go off and think about it. So I know in the seminar that I plan to do with everybody next week, part of it is to try to be as practical utopian as possible, thinking about solving problems, but bringing it in through some of these texts I'll be talking about is Haraway, and then this Max Liboiron, who wrote this brilliant and I think immensely essential book called Pollution is Colonialism, that I want to talk in depth about with everybody. So that's some of the things.
Can I just add, well, thank you, Chloe, for working on the microphone, but for the virtual audience, if you just don't mind kind of leaning in a little bit so the virtual audience can hear you a little bit better.
I think what might be easier is if instead of trying to fit all of us on here at the same time, whoever's speaking can just.
Sure, that sounds good.
Yeah. So I'm gonna actually.
Okay.
Speak to both audiences at the same
All right.
time.
Yeah, sorry for this technological glitch. Yeah, I think in reference to what Thyrza was just saying, that in fact, this is a very intersectional problem. And one of the frameworks, I guess the conceptual frameworks of this program is this intersectional relationship to deep ecology and to the problems with climate change. It's an intersectional problem. It's not only an intersectional problem in the sense that it's a complex network of different forces that are impinging on the problems with deep ecology, but in fact, and I hate to use the word structures because we're so into a post-structuralist moment or even beyond that, there are structures like capitalism, like racism, sexism, that are also either playing a part in the problem or manifest themselves from the underlying problem of capitalism itself. And that is, it's funny because one thing in the original, formulations of deep ecology, there isn't necessarily a concept of the negation of capitalism. So it's not necessarily about that. That's never really mentioned in the early texts. Written about deep ecology. But the fact of the matter is there's always this idea of the conspicuous consumption that capitalist systems, create, that is at the heart of these problems with the ecology and deep ecology, and the fact of voices that are coming from indigenous peoples and practices of indigenous peoples that had a very, very different perspective and had a very different relationship to the ecology and their relationship to ecosystems and how they survived and the meanings that nature had for them. And it's like, that's so important for us. So it's not about necessarily negating capitalism as it is about understanding other systems like indigenous systems and allow them to be our guides. So that's like a really important part of this project. And of course, we do have people speaking about, we do have people talking about the decolonization of ecology, that colonization and the decolonization, these problems that are so important to the discussion in the community of artists today and theorists today, especially the idea of decolonization, how those ramifications, what are those ramifications? I'm fascinated today. The thing that I'm really thinking about is this war, this Putin's war, or this war in Ukraine right now. And even in the very beginning, I realized all the pollution, all those bombs are creating, all when they bomb a oil refinery, like they do more destruction to the environment than all of the new regulations on cow farting, agriculture and all this kind of stuff, methane. I mean, just this war in Ukraine. I mean, and of course the possibility of a nuclear war emerging out of this thing, which I think is really scary for me. Anyway, all of these things are part of our program, are really part of our program. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, because I was gonna, you brought up the word decolonization, because obviously capitalism, I think colonialism is obviously the huge sort of overarching theme of so much of this, and capitalism being part of that. And philosophically, the whole idea of an extractive way of dealing with the land, of dealing with knowledge, of dealing with each other. These are ethical questions. This is what I get from this book by Max Leboeuf.
I'm sorry, Thyrza, do you mind just leaning in a little bit,
Okay.
putting the computer a little closer to you?
Anyway, so I was just bringing up again how important issues of colonialism are to all of this, and that we in the West have been brought up with an extractive logic. I think academia is an extractive logic, and trying to think about how we can deal with these questions of deep ecology and learning from one another, and also acknowledging and listening to and standing next to indigenous knowledge forms that are not based on the extractive. These are some of the questions that I want to bring in, so that capitalist theme is part of that larger issue of the colonialism. But we only have about 10 more minutes, so maybe the best thing would also be to be very specific about telling people online and introducing the students to who the speakers are that people will be able to hear from this summer.
I don't have the list. I don't have the list in front of me either, but, oh, you do. Okay, great.
Kind of.
Yeah.
No, you have it on your phone.
Yeah. Imagine that. Hello. I mean, I think everyone kind of here, but I'll kind of summarize. We do have two different things going on. We have the public lecture series, which maybe we should focus on that a little bit, as well as many speakers who will be in-person seminars, which are closed to the public. So focusing on the public lectures, tomorrow we actually have Thomas Saraceno. And I should also mention that all the public lectures are being organized with the Rail and will be streamed on their YouTube channel. So we'll be joining together with them on Zoom, and all of you can join at 10 a.m. New York local time. Can you hear me, Nick and everybody? Okay, good. Yeah, so starting tomorrow on Friday, we'll have the public lectures online with Thomas Saraceno, and then all of next week, every morning at 10 a.m. we'll have lectures as well. So at 10. Yeah.
Be there and square.
Changed.
No, it was 10 the whole time. Tomorrow we have Thomas Saraceno, and then on Monday we actually have Franco Berardi, who will be speaking, and he will actually be addressing exactly what Warren was just talking about, the war, the role of the war in Ukraine, his kind of perspective on this kind of moment of collapse and the role of chaos, actually. So that'll be quite exciting. On Tuesday, we have Victoria Vesna, who will be speaking, and she was actually also part of our program with Saas-Fee last fall. And she will be talking about her work with the, what is the full name of the center in LA that Victoria works with? Do you remember? The Sci Art Center at UCLA. I can't remember all the acronyms. And some curatorial work that she has done. On Wednesday, we have Annalisa Teachworth, who works between New York and Berlin, who will be speaking from Berlin about her own practice as an artist who lives in New York but is from Detroit, and also the relationship with that with her Puerto Rican heritage. Then on Thursday, we have Florencia Portocarrero with Ileana Ota, who will be speaking paired. Florencia is a curator originally from Peru, and Ileana Ota is an artist who I believe is also from Peru, who kind of does work around her own indigenous backgrounds as well. So that will be a great representation of dialogues from the South Americas. And then next Friday, we have Nicholas Beauriard, who will be speaking about his curatorial practice as it relates to ecologies as well. So that's the public lecture series. And then additionally, within the program itself, we have many speakers who are doing in-person seminars. So just to kind of list some of those names quickly, let me look at the top here. So on Monday, for example, we have Laura Bond, who is from Metabolic Studios in LA, who also worked closely with Fong, who will also be joining us on Monday as well. And then tomorrow, just to mention a couple more, we have David Rothenberger, who will be speaking about his work around, I don't know the specifics of it, but it has to do with bird songs and sounds. And then that will be followed by Joan Jonas in the afternoon. So a lot of amazing, really great seminars as well, but hopefully you can add a link to our public lecture series and people can join us on YouTube.
Maybe you can think about it. I'm thinking this could also be a commercial for next year too, right? So the people who are in here on Zoom can find out this is maybe next year you'll go, oh wow, I'd like to be part of those seminars as well as those public talks. So this is part of what we do. So I think at this point we might want to open it up to questions from the Zoom audience or to anyone.
Let me just check.
I'll send it back to Eleanor. I thank you three, but I
think any of you can get online also and join the.
That's true. You can do it through Zoom.
You can also get on Zoom if you wanted to ask questions. But
No,
I know. Just saying. I know.
Hybrid is not good.
No.
Yesterday, I was at the movie theater and I saw two people talking to each other with their iPhones. They were sitting next to each other, watching the movie, and they were texting each other on their iPhones. I thought that was amazing. Yes.
All right. Are we starting the Q&A over here?
Yes.
Great. So thank you all so much for that really robust background on Saas-Fee. That was awesome. Thank you to the audience, Zoom and in person. We have a question from Monica, and I can read it on their behalf. It was put in the chat. Monica's asking, Monica wrote, I'm not picking up everything about deep ecology here. How are you relating that to cognitive capitalism and art/art criticism?
Did everybody hear that question? You want to answer that, Warren?
That's a really good question, and I was prepared to talk about that. So it's interesting that you asked that question. When this idea of deep ecology, I think which this program is really originally was building on Gregory Bateson's book, Steps to an Ecology of the Mind, written in 1972, and then of course. deep ecology is a philosophy, is a theoretical framework that emerges, very, very soon afterwards. But what we're saying basically is that in cognitive capitalism, as I explained what cognitive capitalism was, the mind, the brain, and the new factories in the 21st century, this crisis this crisis that occurs is a whole system of relations that also throw into question what is deep ecology and how it's changed from, for instance, its original, I have it actually here, its original manifesto, I guess, that was written in 1985 by Bill Duvall and George Sessions. So with that, they wrote this manifesto, and there are 8 points, and I'm sure many of you know about it, but in case some of you don't, let me read it. Number 1 is the well-being of human and non-human life on Earth is of intrinsic value, irrespective of its value to humans. So in cognitive capitalism, that becomes interpreted in the sense that human consciousness is not, it has to be embedded with animal and plant consciousness. It's part of the whole mental ecosystem. When this was written, even in 1985, or when the Ecology of the Mind was written, how the brain and consciousness was understood was in a very limited perspective as coming out of what might be called a transcendental idealistic phenomenology, that it came out of concepts of cognitivism and the idea of a priori conceptual frameworks of the mind, which was, may I say, incarcerated in the bony cranium. Today, in cognitive capitalism and in the way that we look at cognitive capitalism, the brain is a intracranial, situated, very important, situated intracranial, extracranial continuum. That is something that exists in the brain and in this bony skull, but it also extends, is embodied, is created in the externalized brain, which is the technological relations, the changing social, political, historical conditions that reach out to the microscopic, but also through the cosmologic. So that is the fact that that the whole concept of the brain and how it relates to deep ecology has completely changed. So that's when the diversity of life forms is part of this value. This is the second part of the manifesto written in 1985. So we understand that variation is absolutely incredibly important, and maintaining variation is important. That what has been going on in the system of capitalism is that man has moved, or human beings, or women and men, human beings, excuse me, have moved away from nature and have created a kind of self-sustaining ecosystem, an Umwelt, but the Umwelt of the human being, instead of being entangled with the animal and all the animal and plant Umwelts, has created its own segregated. We have become more and more segregated. Our Umwelt has become segregated. And when we have come into new technology with cyber culture, that kind of variation has become more and more normalized. So the problem of variation that is, by the way, is incredibly important as a component of the creative potential of art, architecture, poetry, film, and so forth, is the creation of a variation. The human Umwelt is constantly in transition. It's not like for instance, the tick's Umwelt or the elephant's Umwelt, where it's kind of unchanging, that when the baby elephant is born, he's born into a kind of extended phenotype. The Umwelt is a kind of extended phenotype, so that the baby elephant is already involved in a certain ecosystem, that it is an ecological niche that it's completely embedded in. Well, human beings are constantly changing through art, architecture, and various other things are constantly changing their Umwelt. The Umwelt is constantly changing. Is everyone following that? Does everyone understand what I'm saying? So that, and
I understand, but I disagree.
Oh, great. Okay. Well,
I just want to hear more about the tick Umwelt.
Oh my God, that is the most amazing. You know that, that's it.
yeah. Well, that's what the Von Excel.
Yeah.
I'm actually referring to that. But in reality, the beauty of human beings is that that when we die, all our brains die with it. All the relationships to the worlds that we've lived in, all the changes in our neuroplasticity and all the other changes that have taken place also in the glia. It's not just the neurons, it's also the supporting structures and all this other kind of stuff dies with us. However, we leave traces as cultural memory on the skin of architecture, in the language of poetry. The poetry, the way it estranges the common normalized language. It's always disrupting and estranging that language, and what that has to do with this is that this variation is matching the variation in the brain, and that it's this relationship between this variable nervous system and its variation that culture is creating. So anyway, one could go, I don't want to take all the time and take all the air out of the room, but basically, if you go through this manifesto in the course, if you follow along with us, we're going to go through each one of these manifestos, and we're going to show how cognitive capitalism it's changed the landscape in which to understand these different parts of the manifesto and to redefine them.
And isn't the point to resist and restructure? I mean, cognitive capitalism, it should be, I would think, it's just a backdrop. It's to say that's our own wealth, I guess, at this point, and part of it. But that really what you're, as I keep saying, you're interested in the problems. And so what are the questions around deep ecology that artists and people that are speaking?
Because we're a part of an ecosystem. The human being is part of an ecosystem. And we have to admire the world of things and plants and animals for their own intentionality. And it's not about us taking advantage of them and conspicuously consuming them. It's about creating new kinds of harmonious relationships. And cognitive capitalism, and cognitive capitalism is a new way of understanding that. And we have to understand that we're in cognitive capitalism. We're not in Fordism, we're not in post-Fordism. We're kind of in a situation of the incarnate body, and we have to find ways of getting back into our bodies. This is what Grifo will talk about too. And he talks about in his book called The Soul at Work. And we have to get back into our bodies, that we have become alien. Our bodies have become alien to us. So when you have this alienation of the body, and you have this kind of subsumption of the mind and the brain at the cost of everything else. Yes, we still have an industrial economy, we still have an agricultural economy, but the predominant economy is this cognitive capitalism. What does that do to the body? How does that body relate to the bodies of those that we share this ecosystem with? And how do we critique it? There was a reason why, I hate to get into this, but just for 1 second, because I think it has a lot to do with ecology and deep ecology. Like when Donald Trump, our past president, would say some crazy thing in front of everybody, something that was completely untrue. At the same time that he was trying to get a bill through that he wanted to, maybe he wanted to take attention away from one of his nominees for the Supreme Court. So he would come up and create this, say this ridiculous, horrible thing that everybody would be talking about, that the internet would be flooded by. That was cognitive capitalism, because he was talking about the attention economy and he was using the disattention economy. These are the kinds of things that also have to do with climate deniers. That there is an alternative brain that is happening, which is AI, deep learning, the internet, the general intellect that is manifesting itself in the internet, that we're all spending more and more time with, and that these kinds of attention and disattention are not only happening in the attention economy, like you're driving down Sunset Boulevard, you see a neon sign that attracts you to go to a store, but it's also happening in the internet through clickbait, meme magic, creating Google bubbles, creating silos. Those silos are not allowing us to appreciate the ecological disaster. Don't look up, the ecological impending disaster. It's all related. I hope that was clear.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple more questions, so I just want to get to those too. So the next one is going to be from Elaine, and Elaine asks, are you implying with the new development of technology of data collection, in a sense, it is also selective data collection? Therefore, data collection is incomplete. Wasn't this a concern in the 19th century in the development in sciences? Thank you, Elaine. I'm not sure if anybody wants to jump in.
It's basically about the limitations of data collection and asking if that was part of it.
Does anybody else want to ask?
Well, I'm not exactly sure I understand the question, but I think a bigger concern for a lot of us today is not the incompleteness of data collection, but the repleteness of data collection, and more importantly, who owns the data and who gets to use it, and and extract something from that. It's data that's collected from, let's say, all of us as the masses, but we no longer have any ownership of it. Peter Thiel has the ownership of it, or what's his name from Meta has the ownership of it, and can use this stuff that we produce constantly all the time, simply by existing, just the way we breathe in oxygen and produce the carbon dioxide. They could use the carbon dioxide of our data to choke us. That's how I see it.
Can I just jump in again? Always the teacher in me. You have yet to mention Shoshana.
I was just going to mention
Zuboff's.
Zuboff.
Okay.
I was just going to
She has another, I think another work that could be part of this conversation is her massive book called Surveillance Capitalism. And I think that's also what we're talking about. So
Well, yeah, I mean, the big point of that book, I mean, there are many great points of that book, but one of the most important books is this idea of the big other, that it's not just big data, it's the big other. And the big other is this incredible system that is about foretelling the future. It's about prognostication, that our futures are not our own anymore. And I think that's part of the key of the difference between the data of statistics and the history of statistics that I think you're relating to in the 19th century, and the kinds of information that is available today. Yeah.
But again, I really want to insist on the idea of the ownership of it. I mean, the idea that was promulgated for a long time was that socialist planning couldn't work. It would be inefficient because the market was the sort of the computer that put all the data together and worked out the most efficient outcome. Now, I think we can see that if all the data about the economy were publicly owned and publicly available, actually socialist planning would be a much more viable option than having our lives planned by 4 or 5 huge corporations that have much more data even than our governments have.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And our next question will be from Christina. Christina says, you framed the discussion of cognitive capitalism in relation to the immaterial. Could you also address its material contingents? It seems important to underscore the embodied nature of the brain, as well as the materialities that may remain invisible to human perception, but are significant components of the ecological systems in which we are entangled. Great question. Thank you.
So the basics of that question is we talked about the immaterial nature of cognitive capitalism. The person was asking about the material manifestation, which I think would, I mean, to my mind, that makes me think about the idea of neuroplasticity. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about neuroplasticity specifically.
Okay. Yeah. The key here is when Paulo Verno wrote his concept of immaterial labor, and Maurizio Lazzarato as well, and they said that the difference between that immaterial labor, we're no longer making things anymore, where labor is performative. It doesn't leave a trace. Well, it does leave a trace. And that's the difference between early cognitive capitalism and late cognitive capitalism. So as I was saying before, early cognitive capitalism is precarious 24/7 labor, the valorization economy, communicative capitalism, the financialization of capital. And the later stages is the fact that immaterial labor is not so immaterial, that it does leave a trace. And in the late stage, it's through its action on the neuroplasticity of the brain, of the spectator who is at the concert or the political rally, the traces that are left in long-term memory. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that in late cognitive capitalism, the archive and the process of archivalization does no longer takes place in the institution. Well, again, of course it's still taking place in libraries and various institutional repositories of cultural artifacts and such. Of course it's happening. But there is something called neuropower in late stage cognitive capitalism, and something that is also changing, which is that the archaeology of knowledge in a Foucaultian sense, in which these institutions where the archive is maintained is the center of power, is now shifting. And this has to do with long-term memory and short-term memory, which is now feeding the mind's eye. The mind's eye, which is that place in which we imagine and we envision the narratology, the histories, and even look into the future and imagine what we could be doing, the envisioning. This is the new space. This is the new place of power that power is now focusing on. It's the mind's eye, and because of the switch in which the brain and the mind have now become more and more important in terms of labor and in terms of our economy, in terms of commodity, it only makes sense that these aspects of mental imagery and imagining and that becomes even more so when we talk about brain-computer interfaces and the neural link and wired brain being hooked up to the internet, where it really becomes even more involved, so that there's a complete transition. So these materializations of performative labor and immaterial labor are now situated as a kind of memory traces in the brain that then become reinvigorated in the mind's eye, in terms of how we can imagine, and the theater of the mind's eye becomes the place where power now is focused.
Excellent. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna maybe try to bring it back to neuroplasticity a little bit more succinctly, but also bring up our last year's program, which was, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Which was around activists, a term that Warren developed, activist neuroaesthetics, which was actually part of a year-long festival that I worked on, co-curated with Warren and Susanne Prinz from the Kunstverein Rosa Luxemburg Platz in Berlin. And last year's Saas-Fee program was also part of that. And we actually have an archive of all the public videos online on our website. So I would definitely check out the entire conference that's available on our website from that. And part of the basis of that, from my understanding of having worked through that project, is really this idea of neuroplasticity, which is at a very basic level. Like, I think for a long time, people understood the brain as something unchangeable, but neuroplasticity is actually the process of the brain interacting with its experiences and like materially changing. And so I think it's important to think about, as Warren described, this relationship and how, you know, memories and sensorial experiences, you know, all of this affect the development, but also the literal material structure of our brains. And that this, on the one hand, is directly related to cognitive capitalism in the cognitive literal sense of the word, but it's also an understanding of how we are interdependent with our environment. And I think that's the key kind of switch into the program this year, is not only thinking about our brains not just being the material thing in our heads, but that it's an interaction with our experiences. Our whole nervous system, and we know now more about how our guts, our literal intestines, are related to our emotions and our thoughts and feelings. You know, it's a much more complex system. And in a similar way, maybe this is also about decentering the human within that ecological structure as well. So there's like many levels of material manifestation, but I just wanted to re-emphasize this idea of neuroplasticity because it was really part of the basis of the concept of activist neuroaesthetics, which is basically using that understanding towards an intentional change within the neural structure of the brain. And that's the background for which this program is specifically focused on the ecological implications of that.
Yeah, and so just as an addendum to that, what that all is really to say is that, and this is maybe also why I said earlier I disagreed with something Warren said, but it's a disagreement of nuance maybe. Every organism in interacting with it, and this actually goes into the talk I'll give toward the end of the program, every organism as it interacts with its environment changes that environment however minutely, and likewise it is changed by its environment however minutely. And our problem, our big problem is, yes, how can we be intentional about how we change and are changed by the world that is around us and that we make around ourselves collectively. And who's we anyway?
Yeah.
You know?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And our final question will be from Fong. Nick will be asking it on Fong's behalf. So go ahead, Nick. Thank you.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm reading on behalf of Fong because they're installing and opening a show this evening at Rico Maresca. I want to thank all of our participants for this really wonderful conversation and these really important things that need to be discussed. And I just want to thank the audience, the virtual audience, for their patience as we sort of test out some live / virtual events. But this has really been excellent. And I want to read Fong's question in that it's kind of a 3-part, but pretty straightforward. He wants to know if Saas-Fee shares a philosophical relationship with the legendary Black Mountain College, or with Sylvain Loschinger's idea of cultural synthesis, or Peter Lamborn Wilson's concept of the temporary autonomous zone. So for reference, I'll put that in the chat. But if any of those three things are kind of really connected to Saas-Fee, if you could talk about that. Thank you.
Did you hear those three? Black Mountain College, what was the Lottinger?
The cultural synthesis.
Yeah, cultural synthesis or temporary autonomy.
Well, I can't say anything about cultural synthesis because I don't know what he said about it. I think that you know, it would be very ambitious of us to say we were trying to do something like what Black Mountain was doing, because that actually was college, and it was a full-time residential thing that people were at for years. And but I think what we have in common with it is precisely this idea of interdisciplinarity, and that that Black Mountain made a place for people like Buckminster Fuller or John Cage to cut across those kinds of boundaries, and that it, in a way, it kind of made people cut across boundaries. I mean, we think about it in retrospect as an art college. It wasn't an art college. It was a liberal arts college in a way for artists. And you know, when Olson was the head of it, he would say to Robert Creeley, "Oh, you're going to teach history this year." And Creeley would, "Well, I'm not a historian." "Well, you'll become one." You know, I mean, there was a kind of faith in the ability of people to grapple with the matter at hand and find a way to work through it together. And that's that I find incredibly inspiring. You know, I wouldn't necessarily want to go to a surgeon who'd learn surgery from Robert Creeley, but nonetheless, I think that there's a lot to be said for that kind of education, which is also, maybe to add another reference, close to Rancière and the ignorant schoolmaster. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about the temporary autonomy.
I would say that, yeah, I guess I would add that I actually don't see it as a temporary autonomous zone at all. Or, I mean, there's some relationship to it, but I wouldn't say that that's the focus. I mean, I think in my own work in writing with like queer sex positive club culture in Berlin, that's like a much more, you know, kind of related version of temporary autonomous zones than the school. I think the school actually attempts something very specific and very structured, you know, in a generative sense. And so it's actually not about, you know, kind of creating a temporary autonomous zone in a logistical sense, at least. But, you know, maybe like allowing the conceptual room for the transdisciplinary thinking that we were talking about. But structurally, I don't think it's related to that, actually. And I'm also less familiar with the idea of cultural synthesis. I think, as Barry already said, related to Black Mountain Colleges, there's parallels, but it was also a very different project at a very different time.
Great. Thank you, Nick, for asking on Fawn's behalf. Thank you to our guests for your awesome answer.
Thank you to Rael for hosting us as well.
Yes, thank you for joining us. Before we move on to our closing poet, I just wanted to see if Thyrza has anything to add, just to close us off.
Quick poetry reading.
No, I'm looking forward to the poet because Raevan, because the poetry always closes this beautifully. But I feel like that answer, though, was really kind of great because I think it also brought in a lot of you to Fong for that question. And thank you for your answer very much. And thanks, everybody. Look forward to hearing from you, Raevan.
Thank you. Would anyone else like a closing remark? Oh, look at our audience. Hello, everyone.
We thought they should see the poet.
Oh, sure, yeah. So I was so excited to introduce our poet. As you know, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate and treasured rail staff member, Raevan Aliyah Senior, to the stage. New York City bred creative director, singer-songwriter, and multifaceted creative Raevan Aliyah Senior enjoys writing poems about relationships, love, and race relations. Born to a Jamaican father who wrote several 80s songs and authored multiple poetry books, let's just say it's in her blood. Raevan, please take it away.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to start off with a longish poem. I am full on emotion, hormones busting it wide open and dipping it low in the club called Casa de la Rey. I feel for you. I feel for you. I feel for you. Allergic to bad vibes. Peace is my EpiPen. Positivity is my home. Exhausted. I come home exhausted from ingesting everyone's vibes, swallowing your sorrows, digesting your pain, praying for your salvation because now it ties into mine. I want you to be okay. Taking in all of this energy, trying to find my own. How do I feel? What does Raevan feel? Wearing today's skin, I need to shed. The world is on me, no escape. My heart is big and vast, not on my sleeve because that would be the end of me. Okay, and then I'm gonna read another poem. Give me one sec. Okay. I can know all the ugly parts of you and still choose to love you, still choose love over fear that you're going to hurt me, that this is going to end, that I'm going to fuck up, that this is doomed from the start. I can choose now, right now, and for some moments hereafter to love you in your entirety as a whole. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm choosing you, wishing someone could feel that about me, on what it means to love so deeply and freely. Everyone deserves some love, and I always have plenty to spare. Then I have one last one. This is a short one. I am meant for more. That just is. Money is not the answer. A life driven by my divine purpose is the only reason to put one foot on the ground out of bed every morning. My life will be measured by the quality of my relationships, the depth of my love for those who've earned my trust and affection. I will be measured by my pure heart and my passion for things that make you feel something. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Raevan. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you once again to our host and our guests. Thank you to Thyrza, to Sarrita, to Barry and Warren. And we would also like to thank Stalgia and Amy from the Saas-Fee team and the Industry City team for helping make today's possible and help arrange the physical location of Saas-Fee's program this year. We'd also like to thank our live audience who's here in Industry City with us, and also thank you to our Zoom audience as we've been figuring out our technical issues today as we're trying out this new format, which is very exciting. And thank you once again to our guests for having a fabulous conversation for us. And please do check out Saas-Fee's website for the upcoming lectures starting at tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern, streamed on the Rails YouTube account. Over the past 22 years, the Book and Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and our public events, just like the NSE here. So please check the chat to donate to our writers and editors and support our operations here at the Rail. And at 1 p.m., join us tomorrow for a fabulous conversation with William Wegman, Andrew Lampert, and Charlotte Kent on the event of Writing by Artist, William Wegman at Speroni Westwater. And we will conclude tomorrow with a poetry reading by Jonathan Apria. Thanks once again to you all for joining us today, and you can now say hello and goodbye as you leave. Should be able to unmute and say hi.
Thank you all so much.
everyone.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raven.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thyrza.
The Garda, we caught you.